Welcome to Sons of Patriarchy. I'm your host, Peter Bell. Sons of Patriarchy exists to expose the hidden power structures behind Christian nationalism. Through survivor testimonies, shared storytelling, and honest expert critiques from across the political, theological, and cultural spectrums, we shine light on systems of abuse and authoritarian control principally focused on Doug Wilson of Moscow, Idaho, and the movements he has founded and influenced, as well as across Reformed and conservative churches. Our goal is not just to inform, how did we get here, and what do we do about it, but to spark meaningful conversations in homes, faith communities, and public spaces about what a healthier, freer, and more just society can look like. Together, we can dismantle harmful narratives and build communities of mutual respect and diversity. Sons of Patriarchy aims to do what Doug cannot. We will unite people. We do not demand you be like us. We meet you where you are. And while you may not always agree with us, we hope we can agree on this. Churches should be safe. You can find us on all podcasting platforms as well as YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and X, and sonsofpatriarchy.com. Ad-free episodes, bonus content, listening a week ahead of time on both audio and video, monthly Ask Us Anything specials, and many more perks are available across 5 membership levels at patreon.com/sonsofpatriarchy. Much of the same is available via Apple Podcast subscriptions for $4.99 a month. You can give to this work directly at donorbox.com/sons-of-patriarchy. Exclusive Sons of Patriarchy merch is available at sonsofpatriarchy.com/merch. If you'd like to get a hold of us, desire to interview either myself or co-producer Sarah Bader, or you're a news media agency looking for information on Christian nationalism, patriarchy, Doug Wilson, or anything else we covered in this series, go to sonsofpatriarchy.com/contact. Now, on to the episode. In today's episode, we'd like to extend a special shout out to Presbyterian Advocacy Coalition, dedicated to providing women in the OPC the help they need to navigate the complexities of the church court system while being their guide and help along the way. A link to their group is in our show notes. Welcome to Covered Up, Abuse in the OPC, Part 6. In this episode, you'll meet Theresa Garcia Robertson, a former member of Covenant OPC in Grange, Georgia, Zach LeReaux, who's Allie's husband, and she was profiled in Let's Get Spiritual, and Caroline McKuen, director of the Presbyterian Advocacy Coalition. Theresa is the story of grooming by the current pastor at Covenant OPC, Boyd Miller. This also involves her sisters, who will be sharing their stories soon, and it was brought before the presbytery, who subsequently covered it up and decided Boyd was still fit to be their pastor. The trial happened in the summer of 2024. Boyd faced no consequences and is still their minister at Covenant OPC. Zach comes on to talk about the Doug Wilson creep in the OPC church he and his wife attended, sharing his perspective as a man in the congregation largely sold off to the patriarchy. I hope men can listen to his advice. And lastly, Caroline McKuen, director and founder of the Presbyterian Advocacy Coalition. Having been through this in her past, she's devoted herself to the work of justice in the OPC, and I'm not sure I've met anyone who has a better grasp of the Book of Church Order, how the OPC handles all kinds of cases, than Caroline has. We could not endorse her work with more appreciation. Please follow it. Now, on to my full conversation with Theresa Garcia Robertson, who will be exposing the Presbytery of the Southeast, Covenant OPC, and Boyd Miller.
Okay, so I'm Theresa Garcia Robertson, and I would say that I was raised with a Reformed theology, but not in the Reformed church. So my My dad actually helped to start a Reformed Presbyterian church. It was a PCA church in our town of Columbus, Georgia, Westminster Presbyterian. And I was interesting because I was talking to my mom about it the other day, and I said, "Well, when did the Reformed stuff start for us?" And she said, "Oh, it was before you were born." And she said that your dad had helped to start Westminster Presbyterian, but it was before I was born, and she doesn't really know why we didn't stay there. And so when my parents met, they met at a Southern Baptist church. They were both raised Southern Baptist. Dad really wasn't a church goer before he turned 25 and became a believer, but my mom was raised Southern Baptist. They met in the Southern Baptist church. We were at Edgewood Baptist Church in Columbus until I was 5. And then my parents left and started a home church, Columbus Bible Church. And we actually met in our home before we went to this building in Columbus, and we had grown, and we just kind of outgrown our house. We stayed there until I was 8, and we went to Upatoy United Methodist Church, which is truly, to this day, the sweetest, the sweetest church experience I've ever had. We were there from the time I was 8 until I was 14, and it is church the way that God intended it to be, I'm convinced. And I think there is a possibility. I am still looking at it through rose-colored glasses, but most of the people who went to that church lived either next door or down the street or just in the general area. Everybody was your parent. Everyone got on to you. Everyone loved you. It was just an incredibly sweet time. When I was 14, as is customary with the Methodist Church, there was a change of pastors. And so we left and started visiting churches, and a family friend who had been a friend for a long time, back all the way to the Edgewood Baptist Church days, said that we should try Covenant Presbyterian Church. It was an Orthodox Presbyterian church in LaGrange, Georgia, which is an hour away from where we lived. And my mom would even say now she dreaded going because she felt like she knew that's where we were going to end up. And that first Sunday, I remember walking in the doors, and this building sits in the middle of downtown LaGrange, Georgia, which is just this teeny tiny little town. It's a great town. It's a beautiful little city, but it's just this very small church that's very much dwarfed by First Baptist across the street. They're not even in this building anymore, but it was an old Civil War hospital back in the day. And less than 100 people in the building, very small, but still so cramped, even with the number of people. And I remember crying, leaving the sanctuary and going to the bathroom and crying because it already felt oppressive, and I knew this is where my dad was going to feel comfortable. We are Hispanic. My dad's family was from Mexico, and so we get asked a lot, and there are 8 of us, and we were all homeschooled, and so we get asked all the time, "Oh, y'all are Catholic," and we're not Catholic. But I would say that I was always surprised that we weren't, because my dad had such a strong sense of justice and very much a need for, like, this is right and this is wrong and this is black and this is white. And Catholicism really lends itself to, if you've done this, then you can complete steps A through Z, and you're absolved of all of this. And so I think Reformed theology really spoke to my dad because there is such a legalism to it. And there's very much a sense of justice. It is very black and white, and there's not a lot of wiggle room. And again, but that is painting a broad stroke. And I understand that not all Reformed churches are that way. That is my experience with Covenant Presbyterian Church. And it was really, this sounds so dramatic, but it was basically, it felt like the beginning of the end when we walked in.
All right. So now you've walked into Covenant OPC. You're in LaGrange and you're traveling a lot. And I imagine you felt a little bit of a culture shift going from United Methodist Church to an Orthodox Presbyterian church. So what was culture like at Covenant? And can you describe its pastor, Boyd Miller, too, and at least first impressions of Boyd on the front end?
So, at Utah United Methodist, there were obviously a lot of women, a lot of families, but so many of my friends' moms worked. Basically, everyone worked. And my mom stayed home with us, and she homeschooled us. She worked in my dad's dental office, but a lot of working women, a lot of strong, independent women. Shift to Covenant, and you have no women that work outside the home. I'm all for stay-at-home moms, but every single woman was a stay-at-home mom who homeschooled their children. So that was probably the first big, this is it. The men worked outside of the home. The women worked inside the home. Everyone was homeschooled. There were a few families that kind of, I guess, I don't know how to say it. They tested the waters with public school, but then would pull their kids and homeschool them again. So I guess that was one thing, to go from a culture of seeing a mix to seeing there is one way, and very much the chosen way, the right way, that this was where a woman's place was. I would also say it's an oppressive culture. And this is to me, it's the best example of what this was like. So my dad had this friend, Don, who was a missionary and a physical therapist, and lives in Colorado. And Don would come and visit us regularly. My dad and Don met in the Army. Well, Don is one of these people that you are just drawn to him. He just exudes joy and the goodness of the Lord. And he is joy. So Don comes to visit and goes to church with us and goes to Covenant with us. And at the end of the service, I remember standing in the sanctuary, and Don said, "Well, that was something." And he said, "There's no joy here. There's no one's excited about what the Lord's doing in their life. He was shocked. He said, "What do y'all do outside of these four walls?" And I was like, "Oh, well, Boyd goes and talks to, he does a thing at the nursing home, and there's a college Bible study." He was like, "Okay, what else?" There just really wasn't anything. And I hadn't thought about it until Don visited, but there really wasn't this sense of excitement or really just basking in what is the goodness and the faithfulness of the Lord and what he does on a regular basis in our lives. And it's very much a culture of, the sermons are very much pointed towards, you are a depraved human. There's nothing good in you outside of Christ, all of which is true. I am not discounting that, the truth in that. There is nothing good in me outside of Christ. I boast in nothing but him and his righteousness. But there is always a balance. And thank God for getting out and finding that balance in other places. But that does not exist at Covenant Presbyterian Church. And it is hard when you are in the formative years of your life, when you are in the formative, really that spiritual time where it's more than knowing Bible stories and singing songs and going to Sunday school. Like, you're really in high school. It's that time where you're really starting to lean into your faith and trying to figure out what it is. And as a parent now, I see, I would want my high schooler to really be, I would be wanting to set that foundation and know that they were leaning into the Lord and leaning into that relationship with him, knowing that they're going to leave soon. And as scary as that is for any parent, why make it scarier on Sunday morning with how awful the world is and how awful you are? And it really, I would say that on for me, and I would say for several of my siblings too, it did a lot of damage from a spiritual perspective as far as being able to not to know our own self-worth, but to be able to believe that God actually loves me, because apparently I'm so awful. How could he? When what should have been said is, you are made in his image and he adores you. He loves you. He is passionately, fervently chasing you because you are his. But that was not the message of Covenant Presbyterian Church. And so that culture was also shocking because that was not what we were accustomed to hearing. And so that was one aspect of it. And I would say still that was what lingered throughout my experience there. First impressions of Boyd, I would say I think at first you just feel like he's this quirky, kind of odd guy. He was in his mid-30s when we started attending, still single. From what I would say, he has great parents. He went to Davidson. I think he played lacrosse. Like, he's traveled a lot, but just kind of this quirky guy. His parents wanted him to go to law school. He went to seminary instead. So I think that's the first impression, is just quirky and kind of odd, and very knowledgeable about the Bible. And I think what you learn as you go along is being knowledgeable about the Bible and being a person who actually shares the gospel are two separate things.
I like that distinction. That describes unfortunately, a lot of OPC pastors, a lot of Reformed pastors, really, really smart people. But when it comes to pastoring and preaching and encouraging, there's a lot left to be desired.
Yeah.
So reason why we bring up Boyd is he was and still is the pastor of Covenant OPC, and this story will revolve around him, as people will hear. And we have more stories coming out on Boyd, unfortunately. So can you talk about how Boyd became particularly interested in developing a closer relationship to you, not just a pastor and parishioner, but as hey, Theresa, how's it going?
Yeah. So like I said, I was 14 when we started attending Covenant. And my mom at that time, yes, we were homeschooled, but she was also filling in as office manager for my dad a lot. So we would be home and it would be me with the kids, and maybe just for the morning or just for the afternoon. So Boyd would call the house regularly. And we had not been going to the church very long. And he called one day and asked to speak to Mom. And I told him that she wasn't home. And he said, "Oh, okay, that's okay. What are y'all doing?" And so that started basically this 45-minute long conversation. The phone got passed around, talked to all the kids, came back to me. We talked for a little bit longer, and we're getting off the phone, and he says, "Okay, love you." And at 14, I don't think I could have verbalized any of the things that I can verbalize now as an adult. But at 14, I knew that it didn't feel right. I knew it didn't feel like this offhanded comment where you accidentally say it to your boss because you say it to your dad every time that you get off the phone, or your mom every time we get off the phone. It wasn't like that. It was pointed. It was intentional. So I just said, "Okay, talk to you later," and hung up. So I immediately called my mom and I said, "This was really weird. It made me very uncomfortable." And she said, "Okay, how would you like to handle this? And I said, well, I think what I would like is that I want dad to talk to him. I want him to tell him that that made me uncomfortable. I don't want to have another conversation about this. And like that, please don't talk to me. Just don't do it again. She said, okay. So my dad did. And it was either the following Sunday or the Sunday after. We were at Boyd's house for lunch after church. And we were either in the kitchen or dining room, and it was just us. It was just he and I. And he cornered me and said, hey, I want to talk about the conversation we had the other day. And I said, what conversation? He said, well, the one that made you uncomfortable. And I said, well, I know dad's talked to you, and I don't want to have a conversation about this. He goes, well, I have a biblical obligation to come to you and apologize if I have made you uncomfortable. And I said, okay, great. You've apologized. We're done. But that was the first time where I felt like, first of all, he had no regard for my dad's boundaries, for my dad's line that he had drawn and said, hey, here's what happened. She doesn't want to talk about it again. I'm having a conversation with you. And he just blew right past that and did what Boyd wanted to do. Probably a year later, he was teaching a Sunday school class for high schoolers and middle schoolers. And Boyd loved to, I guess play teacher is the right way to put it. So he would give a test, he would take it up, he would take a red pen, he would mark it, he would grade it and bring it back to you the following Sunday. So it was a test on the 10 Commandments. And I finished the test. We get the test back the following week, and I have a very bad grade. Not because I had missed or didn't know all the 10 Commandments, but because I had mixed up 6, 7, and 8. So we had something called fellowship meal last Sunday of the month. It's a potluck meal. Everyone eats lunch together at the church. So it's the middle of fellowship meal, and Boyd asks me if I will come downstairs to the church study with him. I went, and he closes the door. It's just the two of us, and he tells me how disappointed he is in me, that I did not do well on the test he had given, and that was very disappointing, that he expected more from me. That when I got married and had children and homeschooled them, I needed to know the 10 Commandments, and I needed to know them in order. Well, 15-year-old Theresa was as incensed as 36-year-old Theresa is today. And I said, okay, so let me get this straight. One day I get married and I send my children to public school. One day I get married and don't have children. One day I don't get married and it's just me. And shouldn't I just have this knowledge, maybe or maybe not in the correct order, for my own edification, for my own sanctification? And he was irritated with me because I talked back. But from then on, his interest in me definitely waned. And he started focusing on my sister Caroline, who is 18 months younger than me. And I think he realized I was not someone who could be managed or manipulated. And I was not as interesting to him anymore.
Yep. That's can't have a woman who talks back or thinks for herself.
Gosh.
Not in these churches and situations.
I know.
I don't know if you can pinpoint this. And maybe thinking back, it's a little bit easier too, and it's not as easy as when you were a little girl. And maybe I can slightly change the question. Did you ever feel like he was pastoral towards you, or he's more like, it's like, she's a potential romantic interest for me. I need to figure this out.
Any
And mind you, like for those who are listening, sorry, he's how much older than you are?
Oh, let's see. If I was 15, he was at least 15, 16, 17 years older than me. And I do want to say, like, if someone Googled me, they're going to find that my husband is 25 years older than me. And we have a beautiful life and a beautiful family. For me, it wasn't the age difference. The real issue here is that Boyd Miller's interest in underage girls, who
Okay.
he has a authority over as a pastor, is inappropriate at best.
It'd be just as weird if he was 22, interested in a 16-year-old girl.
Correct. It is the fact that the victim is underaged.
Yep.
So I would say that for me, as I think about our relationship, it never felt pastoral. It always felt buddy trying to be in and be the pastoral. I put that in air quotes. Like it was never pastoral. It felt like a power grab. So anytime he wanted to, it was never out of care or concern. It might be masked as that, but it was more so admonishment because I need to control what you're doing. Does that make sense?
That does. Yeah. Yeah. Are you aware, and this is not in the original set of questions, but are you aware, even though the OPC and other NAPART denominations have kind of formally declared anything Wilsonian as out of the pale and theology is bad and everything's bad, but sometimes his work on family, his work on marriage, his work on relationships or kid raising, like not as bad and some good stuff. Whether it was Doug's or Canon Press's stuff in particular, or maybe just the ethos, the cultural, sociological stuff. Were you thinking back, or even then too? Were you aware of like parallels? And now, I guess even more specifically, thinking back now, like, oh my gosh, this is whether it was from him directly or not. Like there's a lot of parallels here.
Yeah, there are, and what's so interesting. So my dad died in August of this past year, and we've been going through things, and we found the what is it? The Principles of Life, the Bill Gothard stuff.
Oh yeah. The IBLP, something like that.
Okay, so my mom told us when Happy Shiny People came out, my mom told us that she had been exposed to this curriculum, that she had been a part of a group that they studied this. Like she was very much exposed to it. What was wild was that over New Year's, we were going through a bunch of boxes and we found my dad's notebook on the same curriculum when he was in dental school in Dallas, Texas. My mom was doing it in middle school and high school. My dad was doing it in dental school, totally separate from one another. So they had both been exposed to this type of theology, this type of thinking. And I didn't become aware of Doug Wilson until 2020 and the singing in the parking lot. And then I did this whole deep dive and found out about Moscow, Idaho, and read their letter about people moving there and make sure you have a job before you come here, and the letter from the elders of the church. So what I more so associated our life to and the way of thinking and the theology that my dad embraced wholeheartedly was really more the Bill Goddard stuff. All of that was way more in my mind what had started so much of where we ended up. And then to end up at Covenant OPC was this, it was legalism on steroids. I mean, look, Paul talks about it being better to remain single and really glorifies singlehood. But it has always been odd to me that someone who wasn't married and didn't have children was giving lots of advice to married couples and to people with children that had no experience at all in any of this. And I'm not saying that there aren't people who can do it, but it's definitely not Boyd's area of expertise or something that I think he does particularly well. So, I mean, but again, all of that, the thought processes that he has very much aligns and is parallels with what Doug Wilson preaches.
Yep.
Yeah.
I just say, and it's Wilson's just better at marketing it than anybody else has ever done it before. He's made it less fringe and like cool. It's like, this is what people do to be part of this this cool, like, not hip. I don't think he would use hip, but like bad boy reformed image.
Yeah, it's very, which is interesting because and I guess this is kind of jumping ahead, but I can't think of another, but outside of Presbyterians, and really not the USPCA, but if you think PCA, OPC, the Presbyterians are very focused on this idea that we came from Scotland and like everyone's obsessed with Scotland. Boyd, very obsessed with Scotland. I think he has Scottish heritage. The whole beard thing is a big deal. The whole, like, it's all very like, oh, I'm reformed, I have this. And when we were going through our process this past summer, which I know we'll get to, one of the things that Hank Belfield said to one of the husbands on one of our Zoom calls was, oh, is that a new beard that I'm seeing? And he said, no, I don't think it is. And he said, oh, well, shame on me, a reformed guy, not noticing a great set of whiskers. And I was listening to the conversation again this morning and I thought, what a bizarre thing to focus in on. But the Presbyterians, again, like the Methodists don't act like that. The Baptists don't act like that. The Catholics don't really focus in on, I mean, it's just Presbyterians. It's like, oh, Scotland, like we have this very, I say I go to a Baptist church now, but Presbyterians definitely have it's a look, it's a thought. It's odd to me. Mm-hmm. And Doug Wilson, obviously, a little obsessed with Scotland.
Yep, very much so. Yeah, so much so that he's named basically everything off of it.
Including his new college, New Aberdeen in North Carolina.
That's right. I remember when you texted me about this. I'd never heard about this. It's like, of course, Aberdeen and St. Andrews, the two Scottish. That's right. And I know I'll talk to others about this as well. And if you can, because I'm imagining, we already know our statistics. It's like 65-35 female male who are listening to this. So our assumption is many other women who are listening to this have had this happen to them. And they're like, oh my gosh, other people have had this happen to them too? Yeah. I had no idea. So what's it like when you're at a church and you're expecting this pastor to feed your soul, to be, a friend to you, but also to be spiritually nourishing, authoritative in the sense that like he's gonna teach you the things of God.
Sure.
You see as an authoritative figure, but now he's making, or not now, he's only ever been making romantic advances towards you. What's that like, having a pastor who does this, and then how that has shaped and formed your view of pastors? Because we've talked about this previously too. It's hard to look at a pastor, I imagine now, and wonder like, when are you gonna start like showing interest in me? I'm just kind of waiting for that day.
Yeah. Honestly, I think it breaks you. It did me. I remember on the way, so it was an hour from our house to LaGrange, and we would listen to Ravi Zacharias on the radio mornings on the way to LaGrange. And I remember feeling that Ravi was feeding my soul. He was giving the gospel message. Ravi always said that the gospel is for thinkers, and I can prove it. And I remember knowing that what was happening at Covenant wasn't right, not just from a pastoral or from a preaching standpoint, because it was so dark, but also seeing that, watching him pivot from me to my little sister, watching this obsession with her grow, an obsession that was seen by not only people in our age group, where it was a running joke that Caroline was Mrs. Boyd Miller. All the children, all the teenagers knew that Boyd was romantically interested in Caroline. So much so that he had given her a Bible. He said that he ordered the wrong one, and he had already written his name in it, so he gave it to Caroline. And a friend of ours, as a joke, wrote Mrs. in front of Boyd Miller, because, again, running joke, widely known and accepted that Boyd had romantic interest in a 15-year-old. So there was that happening, and it felt wrong. Like, being there felt wrong. And so I remember thinking, well, it's okay. Every Sunday I listen to Ravi Zacharias. And it's hard to think of anything more devastating happening with someone that I don't even know than Ravi dying, and all of this truth coming out of who Ravi actually was. That he had raped women, that he had sexually assaulted women, that he had sexually harassed women. And I thought, oh, okay, this is more common. Now, our pastor is careful and kind, and there are safeguards, and I'm very open about asking about safeguards and how are we holding you accountable, and Jimmy is wonderful and has never taken anything personal when I've asked the questions, because it's protecting all of us. And he also is very much in tune with what my background is, but it is again, those formative years, those years of really trying to figure out who you are, trying to figure out what your relationship with God is going to look like, trying to figure out who God is for real, not just as this person, this thing that your parents talk about and you go to church every Sunday, but you're living a real life. You're getting ready to be out on your own. Like, life is about to really, for real, happen. And all you know is dysfunction and what's wrong and what should not exist at church.
So I'm asking this question for women who are possibly in your shoes when you were 15, 16, 17 years old. Maybe they're thinking, I just don't have Theresa's like independent, strong personality who can just tell him no, or like you tell your dad or you tell whoever it is, like, I'm not comfortable with this. And they're thinking, I don't know if I can do this. I'm going to get in trouble. So how did you get out? Like, how did you have the wherewithal, the strength to say no? Because that's really hard for a lot of, and I think people will beat down women who can't say no. It's like, well, just say no. Then he's like, it's not quite that simple, nor that easy. So like, where does that come from, and what did that look like? Like, how'd you get to that point, and then how'd you leave?
So in contrast to other people that have told their stories of Pipa, stories of Belden, all of these stories where honestly more aggressive perpetrators, right? Sure. I would say Boyd is less aggressive in that sense. Like, he's more careful in that sense, which is all
long simmer. Yeah.
Which is scarier, I think. But I will say it wasn't easy. And I remember having being terrified to have this conversation with my dad that I was in college and I did not want to be there anymore. I didn't want to do the long drive. I'd started out at LaGrange College, so I was in the same town. Boyd was incredibly intrusive, incredibly demanding of my time, showed up to have lunch with me at college, on campus. There was zero wiggle room for me to miss Reformed Bible study, or Reformed Bible Fellowship. It was RBF. And I ended up at Columbus State University in my hometown. And I remember being terrified to talk to my dad about not making the drive, not being at Covenant anymore. And the conversation was a lot easier than I anticipated. And I basically had like a PowerPoint presentation ready to give him of all the reasons that I shouldn't go there and I should go to St. Andrew's Presbyterian in Columbus, which felt like this great compromise, you know. Still going to go to a Presbyterian church. It's still Reformed. I'm still going to be, you know, in a Bible believing, whatever church, all the criteria. But I remember being terrified to do that. I also remember the moment I realized that me saying no sacrificed my little sister. And if I could do it all over again and not be the one to say no, so that she would not have experienced what she has experienced and the hurt and the trauma that she has gone through because of Boyd Miller, I would. Because it was awful. He groomed her. He wanted to marry her. She was 14 years old and he wanted to marry her. And so my saying no to him came at an incredible cost for my sister. So saying no wasn't easy. Realizing that my ability to say no cost Caroline so much. None of it is easy. None of it. I was listening to Stephanie's episode, and the thing that stuck out to me, I knew her story already, and listening to her tell it was incredibly hard. But the part that stuck out to me was when you asked her, how did you keep the faith? And she said, I didn't. God kept it for me. Because that's who he is. That is who he is. When we can't, he does it. It's not a meeting halfway. God literally comes all the way to us. And at first, I really thought about Caroline. Caroline never wavered, never thought. She always thought there's something in this. She is incredibly faithful and has been an example to me of how to remain in the Lord through all of this, which has been an incredibly traumatic religious experience. But I so felt that in my soul. I didn't keep the faith, but God kept it for me. Getting out, and for me, even though I left the church, my family didn't for years. And so his influence in our life was so incredibly oppressive and continues to be.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that. So unfortunately, Boyd Miller is still a pastor in the OPC and is still a pastor at Covenant OPC, even though everything you've just told me has already been made public in that presbytery, which is why we're having you on, and we're naming names and not being honestly not caring what they think about it. So this was brought up in the Presbytery of the Southeast.
Yeah.
How did they handle this?
Not well. So I think it warrants to say that there was a conversation, and Caroline is going to tell her story. But there was a conversation between Boyd and Caroline where he basically proposed marriage to her, and she was about 16 years old. And nothing was done about this. I love my dad. I'm definitely a daddy's girl. But he did not address this. And there was a blind spot for Boyd, which I, to this day, could not explain to you. So I went to the elders of Covenant Presbyterian Church. I went to a man named Jim Channel. I was 19 years old, and I went to Jim Channel and told him what was happening. I had an email that Caroline had written to a teacher, a theater teacher of ours, and she had outlined the entire situation of what happened, and I took it to Jim Channel. And he was a ruling elder, and his response was, well, this is a really big accusation, and, young girls, they kind of want attention, and they're prone to make things up in order to get attention. So this is really more of a he said, she said, and I just don't know that we're really going to do anything about this. And that was it. He apparently went to Boyd and talked to Boyd about it, didn't bring any other elders in. Covenant at any given time has 3 ruling elders, and did not talk to the other elders about it. And Boyd told him that he had taken care of it, and Jim Channel believed him, supposedly, and that was it. So fast forward almost 20 years later, in May of this year, the elders of Covenant Presbyterian Church reached out and asked if we would be willing to share our stories. 2 elders that I don't want to name, they were incredibly grieved. One had been there the entire time, admitted that he had seen things and not addressed them. Jim Channel tried to tell us that the Holy Spirit had only recently convicted him of this, which was convenient and laughable. The other elder told us, look, my kids are so much younger than you that when this was happening, I was in diapers. Hell, that was my life. I was looking at toddlers in diapers. Y'all were in high school. Y'all weren't even on my radar. So I wasn't noticing any of this. He wasn't an elder at the time. They quickly got overwhelmed by these stories and called in the shepherding committee of the Southeast Presbytery. And so the shepherding committee sends in the subcommittee, which is made up of, at that time, I'm sure they've changed at this point, but it was made up of Nathan Trice, Hank Belfield, who was also a part of Stephanie's story, which was chilling to me, and Joby Fowler. So what made the name Hank Belfield so hard to swallow in Stephanie's story was that for us, Hank was the most empathetic. He was the one who it almost was like he was putting words in our mouth sometimes. He's like, would you describe this as Boyd being obsessed with your family? Would you say it almost seems as if he's has an authoritarian style of pastoralship. I mean, he was helping to drive the conversation against Boyd. And yet he's been a part of absolute horror in other people's lives. So I had my first conversation with the shepherding committee July 11th of last summer. My husband sat with me because I recognized that I was going to be taken more seriously by these men if my husband was there. And I do believe we all did this there were 3 of us that shared our stories. We all did it within the presence of our husbands being on camera as well. So we have this 2-hour conversation. They asked a lot of questions. And they brought my dad into this. My dad was dying of pancreatic cancer. We never would have brought this up the summer my dad was dying. But I said, look, I'm not defending my dad at all or his part in this. He should have addressed it and taken care of it. But I think that also lends itself to the manipulative nature of Boyd Miller. He had my dad totally fooled. He had him, and I don't really know how. So the shepherding committee kept saying, well, we have there's a limit on these things. It's a 2-year, statute of limitations. If you don't bring it up within the first 2 years, then we can't really address it unless you were somehow kept from reporting. Like, well, I was kept from reporting 20 years ago when I told Jim Channel, who's a ruling elder, what happened, and then nothing was done. So I think that the timeline at this point doesn't matter because I was kept from reporting it, because in my mind, I had reported it. And keep in mind, at 18, 19 years old, I was like a semi-adult. I wasn't even a real adult yet, but I was the only person who was willing to go and speak out against Boyd. The shepherding committee interviewed all 3 of us. They did what they called an investigation. So that started in May. Boyd was put on leave. July, I had my first meeting with the shepherding committee. All of our meetings happened in that time frame. So in August, they had their first, they completed their so-called investigation. So in this investigation, they were finished, and on August 21st, they sent a letter to the congregation, who knew that Boyd was on leave because of what they called credible, to their credit, they called it credible allegations of misconduct. And the pulpit had been filled by other pastors, and nobody supposedly knew why. Although I did say from the very beginning, there is no way that Boyd is not running a campaign right now. And of course, later we found out all these people in the congregation that he had been talking to and sharing, so-called details of what was going on. So the shepherding committee writes this letter to the congregation, and, allegations of misconduct against your pastor, Reverend Boyd Miller. The session wanted advice in how to rightly respond to them. June 14th, your session formally requested the shepherding committee to undertake the investigation of these allegations, with Reverend Miller being on a leave of absence during that time. After multiple meetings and much deliberation, this shepherding committee completed its report on its findings. So they said, the report we will be bringing to you is more extensive than we can attempt to include here. We want you to be aware, however, that while our committee found no grounds for recommending disciplinary action against Reverend Miller, we have found serious indiscretion and a misuse of spiritual authority in his past conduct, with ramifications sufficient to warrant recommending his resignation from the pastorate of Covenant Church. So Boyd agreed to resign. He wrote a letter of resignation, which was incredibly interesting because in it, he took zero responsibility. He said, while I personally had hoped to continue my ministry here at Covenant, I have offered my resignation to our session pending congressional concurrence. I know this news is hard. I truly had hoped for a different result, but take responsibility for my own past imprudence, which contributed to the disaffection of former members and created disunity in the greater body of Christ, despite efforts at reconciliation. So Boyd had come to us, all three, multiple times. My sister offered forgiveness. The other person involved had offered forgiveness. I admittedly offered vague forgiveness, telling him that at no time would he ever be a part of my life, which was the part he couldn't get past. With all of us, he kept coming back because what he wanted wasn't forgiveness. What he wanted was absolution and for everything to go back to the way that it, quote unquote, had been. So they have their first meeting. All three members of the subcommittee come to LaGrange. They supposedly share their findings. They refuse to use the words grooming. They refuse to use the word sexual assault. And had a meeting beforehand and agreed that they were not going to use any language that would be difficult or abrasive to the ear. And we asked repeatedly when we finally heard back from them. They promised that they were going to follow up with us. They never did. We had to reach out to them and say, we've heard you've had these meetings. We'd like to know more. So that was the first meeting. They just basically, it was like here's what we found. We want to hear from y'all. We're going to take a vote. So they were going to take a vote the next week. So two of the elders said, look, if you vote to keep him, we will leave. It is that egregious. So the following week, Nathan Trice is the only one who came back to Covenant Presbyterian Church. They had a moderator come in, and Boyd was at the meeting where four people spoke to get rid of him. And 12 or 14 people spoke to keep him. Mm-hmm. They took a vote and decided to keep him. And Boyd immediately withdrew his resignation.
Gosh. Okay.
So.
Shocker.
I know, right? So the two other elders submitted their resignation and left the church. So the only two ruling elders left at this church are Boyd Miller, the pastor, and Jim Channel, who was told about all of these things, knew about all of it, didn't address it. So the only two people left are the guy who committed all of these atrocities and the guy who covered for him. So in total, what we know of personally, there were 6 families that left Covenant when all of this happened. I was called woke. I must be woke for bringing up all of these charges. One person said that if she ran into us, she would just want to know, what is wrong with you? One person said, well, Theresa's always had it out for Boyd. And she's always said if it's the last thing she does, he will not be the pastor here. And at first that really hurt my feelings. And then I thought, wait a second. No, of course that's what we need. Not for justice for me or even justice for my sister, but to protect the other young women who are in this congregation who I have witnessed Boyd be inappropriate with. So they keep him, and they finally have a meeting with us. It lasted, 2.5, 3 hours. The shepherding committee did. And they did absolutely everything within their power to dissuade us from anything else. It was very much, we are going to pray for you to be able to forgive Boyd and move on. And so we said, well, what if we wanted to do more? What if we wanted to bring a charge to Presbytery? Well, you'd have to find someone who is still a member of the OPC to bring the charge for you. And then, you would be questioned by the person you're accusing, the person who's inflicted all of this on you. And, you're just, we would never want to inflict that on you. They said that they were as shocked as we were. That was not the way that they saw it going, that they really thought that, Boyd would resign and there would be a new pastor at Covenant, a new day. And when we continued to press that we wanted more done, we were blocked. We reached out to the Presbyterian Advocacy Coalition. Caroline McKuen reached out on our behalf. They told her that there was nothing that they could do about it. This was taken to the presbytery in October because of the nature of this, because of the sensitive nature. It was the report was read in executive session. And then they had apparently the executive committee had questions, and then no one decided to do anything. In the same meeting, we find out that Boyd Miller was a member of the shepherding committee, but had recused himself while he was under investigation. But we only find this out at the end of their so-called investigation. We were definitely blamed. The shepherding committee would say absolutely not, that they kept calling us so brave. They kept apologizing to us that for bringing up things that were so hurtful. They kept saying thank you. It was like they had taken a crash course in how to talk to victims. That was like an HR course, because it was thank you for doing this. We're so sorry for the hurt that you've experienced. But they really hammered the fact that the inciting incident, which was a physical incident multiple times with this third victim, her abuse and the fallout from that was completely ignored. And they really, my sister, she had paper trails. She printed off 60-something pages of Facebook messages between Boyd and herself that are so difficult to read.
Yep. She's told me about these. Yep.
It's wild. I was reading them to my husband while we were on a road trip Memorial Day weekend last year. And he was like, I can't. This is awful. This is so uncomfortable to listen to. But Caroline's story had paper trails, and hers only had the strength of the turmoil left in its wake. And they chose to almost totally focus on Caroline as a way to diminish the actual criminal activity. Which I just feel is this theme of, well, it happened a long time ago, and we can't really prove that the physical thing happened, and you're married now. We hate that it happened, but you've moved on. Thank you for bringing this to light. But there's nothing we can do. They leaned very much into this, the almighty book of church order that they want to use, that, the congregation really has the deciding choice on what they're going to do. And we just can't do anything about it. There's nothing we can do. And so we still sit totally, there's no resolution. Boyd is still the pastor. And there are people in that church who have admitted to recognizing the behavior between inappropriate behavior between Boyd and their underage daughter, and chose to ignore it and to blame their daughter. And the only thing that I know to do at this point, because the presbytery is obviously not going to do anything, is to tell our story and to warn as many people as possible to not go to that church.
Amen. Yeah, that's, and you've seen those guests who've come on who've been accused, and we've been accused, like, why aren't you going through the proper channels? It's like, I don't think you realize the proper channels, proper in quotes, have already been gone through, which is why people are now coming and speaking out and saying, hey, I think the proper channels are broken.
Yeah.
And we're now speaking out. So yeah, that's for those who are listening. It's like, oh, you guys aren't following Matthew 18. You guys aren't following 1 Timothy. You guys aren't following Titus. It's like, no, actually, those were followed and pretty closely to the T. And look
we
where
did
that got
everything
us.
right, and we did everything in our power over the summer. I mean, the amount of phone calls that I made to people who are in presbyteries. My brother-in-law is in a presbytery. He's a PCA minister. We have dear friends who are in the PCA, and we're like, explain. We know it's not exact, but explain. I read this. Explain to me how this particular, procedure works. Do you feel like it could be the same in the OPC? What happens when you do this? I mean, we did everything within our power to address it in the way that they would be most accustomed to follow their policy and procedure.
Yeah.
And we were met with absolute deaf ears.
Yep. Now you will not be met with deaf ears.
Hoping.
So at least those listening, and we will put pressure, and people will know what's going on, at least on a much, much wider scale than 5 dudes in a presbytery or 10 dudes in a presbytery, whatever it may have been. So concluding, not a question, but any final thoughts from Theresa? Any final thoughts that you want to leave listeners with, those who are in the OPC, those who are wondering, can I speak out? How do I speak out? Is this happening to me? I know it's a lot of different questions.
Yeah.
But anything you'd like to leave those listening to your story, and warnings about Boyd, warnings about Covenant OPC in LaGrange, what would you like to leave listeners with?
If I could start with LaGrange, I would say don't go. If you don't have young daughters, just don't go.
Mm-hmm.
It's a toxic culture. And it's a congregation who will defend their pastor no matter what, and he's done egregious and horrible things, and they will defend him no matter what. So there is no safe space there. I've never personally known Boyd Miller to be interested in anyone his own age. There have been supposed people, but I've only ever witnessed him be interested in girls who are anywhere from the ages of 14 to 18 consistently. That's my personal observation.
Yep. From a man who's 30s when you knew him up until his 50s now.
Definitely in his 50s now. So that's what I would say there. Getting out, making a choice. I mean, it's no different than any other abusive situation. You have to know, you have to be ready. No one can make that choice for you. You have to decide it's been enough. And I wish I could say it gets easier on the other side. And one day it does. It does. And there's a time when you don't think about it every day. You leave and one day you don't think about it every day until, you get a phone call out of the blue. And all of a sudden you're reliving it in order to attempt to right what has been wronged. But one day you stop thinking about it every single day. One day you get out and you stop thinking about it every day, and you live this life that has purpose and meaning and joy. And And my life verse is, I would have despaired unless I believed I would see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. And I have always leaned into that psalm because it has rung so true. I mean, there is despair in these situations. And until the day comes when you are ready to get out, you just have to believe that you're going to see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. And I cannot tell you what a balm to my soul and what I do believe this podcast and this community of people who have banded together to speak out and put light on the darkness. This is the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. And I'm so incredibly grateful for that.
Next, we move to Zach LeReaux, the husband of Allie from Let's Get Spiritual. So, let's get to know him.
Yeah, absolutely. So I am Allie's husband. My name is Zach LeReaux. I'll be honest. So I didn't grow up in the church, and so kind of being exposed to just even the Doug Wilson name, Federal Vision or things of that nature. It wasn't something that was openly discussed, or at least not common to be openly discussed. And so the first I remember clearly of sort of being introduced to just kind of this whole realm was from our associate pastor at our old church. We had just moved out to North Carolina, and we weren't yet official members, and we were sharing a meal at their home. And he had brought up that there was a recent church split, and just letting us know that hey, this happened in the recent past, and was saying that it was on the basis of several families being suspicious that their head pastor supported Federal Vision. I don't remember specifically if he brought up Doug Wilson's name initially, but I know that that kind of gave some excitement to my wife in particular, because she had been raised in in a church community and environment, and certainly in her family, just heavily influenced by Doug Wilson and his teachings. And so because of that, she kind of, her ears perked up and said, she wanted to talk about this some more. And the associate pastor kind of assured us that the head pastor was examined by the session and deemed, to not be a Federal Vision, supporter. And so this conversation is something that really set us off on really a sort of level of base trust with this church and this community. And I would say that's what sparked my initial interest in researching about Doug Wilson and Federal Vision, just because prior to then, again, it's not something that was openly discussed in any of the church communities that we were a part of. And I think over time, as I kind of learned more about Doug Wilson and Federal Vision and just things that are kind of associated with the CREC, I started to notice a lot of parallels and patterns, not just in our specific church, but in church communities that we had been a part of in the past. And so that's kind of how my exposure to it grew over time. And obviously researching Federal Vision, had some immediate concerns and disagreements with I would say the majority, if not all of its tenets. And so right off the bat, it was an immediate, okay, we should distance ourselves with this way of thinking. And so we had thought that the church that we were joining and becoming a part of was a safe space to kind of be apart from all that.
As you heard, he didn't grow up religious, so this was an entirely new world for him. But he knew Allie's background and what was important for her, so what he began learning about their new church in North Carolina was concerning. Here's what he found out.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I would say because we were very invested into this church community, and I think there really was an element of, we didn't know what we didn't know, because again, we had sort of like that baseline trust, and I guess, part assumption as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so because of that, we just, time just kind of went on. I would say it wasn't until about 4 years into going there where I started kind of realizing a very distinct pattern of just sort of the community, as a whole, just in terms of, personalities or things that were said, whether they were jokes or quips or things like that. And so it started to form just sort of this, collective realization. But then apart from that, there were very distinct events that happened that just started raising concerns, So, for example, we had a young family not joining the church immediately, but they started visiting. And again, it was about 4 years into our tenure there. And we wanted to meet them. We invited them over and shared a meal with them. And the young man, he was very, very blunt about being a Doug Wilson fan, so much so that he was really, he kind of just took me into our kitchen and was kind of, wanting to encourage me to, to really be, a part of the church militant. And he was saying how, he's really influenced by Doug Wilson. He was part of an online Facebook group. I think it's called Fight, Laugh, Feast or something like that.
Yep.
Yeah. And so that was how he was actually invited to our church. And so that interested me. I was concerned with, things that he was sharing at our table, and just his demeanor was just unsettling too. I mean, he was very, very rude, openly rude, to his wife. And it was a very uncomfortable, first kind of meetup. And it was awkward too, because at the time, we are in our 20s and this is someone who's slightly younger than us. And so it seemed very strange that someone so young, had this sort of like mindset. And so, after that, started researching on Facebook, quickly found who from our church invited him. And we found the specific invitation where, the other church member said, hey, you should come to our church. It's not officially CREC, but it's a local stronghold for like-minded people.
Interesting.
Yeah. And so that was a huge red flag, because I'm thinking, okay, how or why would our church be defined that way?
Yeah.
So,
and this is the OPC you're talking about, right?
Yeah. It was the OPC. I think they're called Resurrection OPC now.
Yep.
So I immediately raised this as a concern to the associate pastor, who I was, close friends with at the time, and he literally responded with, "I don't care." He told me, "I don't care, what so and so has to post on social media. I don't care about any of that." And so. Yeah. And so, that was concerning to me. And then, about at that same time, our head pastor, during a sermon, he quoted Doug Wilson, which we had never heard before. And so again, that was a concern to me. And I actually raised it to 3 separate men. And I raised it with our shepherding elder. I raised it with the associate pastor again. I even raised it with a close friend who was, a longtime member of this community. And what was kind of eerie to me is that all 3 said almost the same exact thing, something along the lines of, I actually like what Doug Wilson has to say about marriage and the family. And, all 3 of them were saying how, Doug Wilson's, teachings were very formative in shaping their understanding of, the family or marriage or things like that. And so I think that was, one of the bigger red flags that, okay, this it seems like Doug Wilson and his teachings are really saturating this community. And then various things happened. I don't remember if it was before or after, but I remember there was an article that dropped revealing a long history of sexual abuse tied to Doug Wilson's church. and it was real detailed in, his, what I would say mishandling of it all. And so at the time I was kind of feeling emboldened with, all of these concerns that I kept raising and not getting, any feedback. So I reposted that article, sort of announcing my disgust with that information. And immediately, the associate pastor and, my other close friend, they reached out and said, hey, this is from a secular source. And so, and it should be discredited. And they were more concerned with, it kind of being quieted. And yeah. And so yeah, there were a lot of, swarming concerns that just kind of were alluding to Doug Wilson. But it was kind of frustrating because anytime, it was brought up, it was either, kind of hushed or just dismissed, or, things like that.
Zach and Allie wouldn't spank their kids, and that didn't fly in this congregation. Something had to be done, so the pastor started preaching on spanking and the consequences of failing to do so. He all but said Allie's name in the sermon, and this is how Zach reacted.
Yeah, no, that was a tough one for sure. Initially, so we had known that, because we've been used to being a part of Christian circles, and that being an element of our lives that we don't feel like we can be as transparent and open with, because more often than not, the response to that is very negative and very defensive. And so it's one of those things that we felt like, we feel differently. We can still be a part of these communities, even though they're making this choice to spank. And so we felt like it was more of like a tertiary issue at best.
Sure.
And, but what was interesting was, it seemed like so many of the conversations that I'd have, and especially with the associate pastor, because again, he was sort of my closest friend there. They would gravitate toward the need to spank. So anytime we talked about any kind of parental struggles or things like that, and then even when we didn't, it seemed to find its way in conversations more often than not. And so initially, admittedly, I was trying to be dodgy just so that it wouldn't turn into this confrontational. Yeah. But yeah, initially, when he did sort of more directly ask me, I made it clear to him, that's just not what we do. And I don't know if maybe he just didn't know how to respond to that, but he did specifically say that, we can agree to disagree, kind of a response to it. And so I thought, okay, cool. This maybe this isn't, that big of a deal. But what's interesting was, as time went on, when Allie specifically would share things like on social media, he and others, they just really took issue with it. And, like there was a time when he came to our house and had a stack of papers, printouts of her posts, and was saying, he's got concerns because, all of these things that she's reposting are erroneous and they don't align with scripture. And, he said in our home that, the reason why we spank is because we're saving our children from Sheol. And we couldn't get him to expand on that specifically, but the implication there is that you're spanking to prevent your kid from going to hell. Mm-hmm. And so I think that was the intent of him communicating that. And so it really shed light on why this would be such a big issue to them, because if you could imagine from their perspective, they're rescuing their children from hell via spanking. It's going to be very important to them. And so, like you said, there was a Sunday when I wasn't there, at church because I was sick. And I've listened to this sermon a couple times, and there is a very definitive shift from the first half and second half, which is very interesting. The first half, it's a sermon about Ezra, and then the second half, he immediately shifts to spanking and spends the remainder of the sermon basically saying that we need to spank even though it's uncomfortable, and if we don't, we're sort of rejecting what God's commanding us to do, and so yeah, it was unfortunate that Allie had to endure that. And then I think the icing on the cake for that specific, that moment for her at church is the fact that several members knew that it would have addressed her directly, because they went to her and approached her and said, "Hey, how are you doing? Are you feeling okay?" And so it's just heartbreaking that one, there was some bullying happening, from the pulpit, and that the community was aware of it. And they kind of didn't care.
To conclude my conversation with Zach, I asked him if he could speak to the men listening to this series. Though 2/3 of our audience are women, and a vast majority of abuse cases in the CRAC and the Reformed world are committed against women, men need to be aware of the influence this has on them. Because this abuse against women is perpetrated by men. It teaches us, informs us, and to the kind of man who does these things and is all right with them. So to the men, please listen to Zach with me.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I will say it seems to be exceedingly rare that I even get a chance to speak with another husband who is similar minded in these ways and these views. But when it comes to incidents of spiritual abuse, I am sad to see that oftentimes when I'll discover that these women are married, the husbands don't really have much to say, and they're kind of just they're not as vocal about it. I don't know. I guess one of the main things is, try to not be afraid to speak up and advocate alongside your wife. But I would say even before that, just, try to listen, with open ears. I'll have to admit that, initially when we were experiencing the things that we did, I certainly heard Allie but I remember feeling this tug in two directions where it was like, I need to be a support for my wife, but how do I make this work and still fit us in this community? And so I do think that for a lot of men, that might be part of it. How do I balance this and try to win on both sides? And I would say that, you're married to your wife, and so you need to, I would say you need to prioritize, her safety, her care, and at the very least, simply listen, to her hurts. And, but yeah, I would like to see more men, speak up, in particular husbands. It would be encouraging, especially for someone like me, to see, more and more men at least physically be present, with their wives when they're being interviewed, in cases like this, or, if they're putting their name out there, if the men, felt encouraged enough to say, hey, my voice is in there too. And, we're dealing with this together. So yeah, I mean, that would be my encouragement to husbands in particular.
Lastly, and as a preview to a special episode we have with Caroline McKuen of the Presbyterian Advocacy Coalition and Lynna Sutherland of Advocacy from the Presbyterian Pew, I discussed the work Caroline started a few years ago, aiding and helping women navigate the church court system with charges of abuse. Here's a snippet of that conversation.
Sure. The Presbyterian Advocacy Coalition is the nonprofit organization that we've put together to help people just in a lot of different ways, and some of them are really specific to Presbyterian churches. Because what we found is that when you're in this situation where you are either in an abuse situation and no one is helping you, or you sometimes have even been, some of the women that we've helped have had charges filed against them for leaving their husband or refusing sex to their husband or whatever it is. A lot of times people just don't know what to do. Like, there's no number to call. There's this theory, the Book of Church Order is, in theory, you could appeal or you could, but how do you write the appeal? Where do you even take it? And to go into these meetings with the elders when you're the only one there who's a woman, and then you're sitting in front of this panel of 5 men, that's such an intimidating situation. So we've over and over again, we heard that, people saying, well, I got this letter saying I was under discipline. I don't even know what that means. I don't know what to do about it. We had cases where women were being put on trial and they were being assigned counsel by the church that was putting them on trial. But it was, in one case, it was the counsel that was assigned was the wife of one of the elders who was putting her on trial. So that wasn't exactly an unbiased source. And so things like that. In some case, the counsel that was supposed to help them didn't even talk to them before the trial, refused to even speak to them. So all of these issues we're trying to resolve just by offering some actual assistance to people. So we have a hotline number, and the hotline is really for whatever situation. If someone is just in an abuse situation, they want to talk to somebody, and we do a lot of just connecting people with local resources. And we don't try to, to help people to escape directly from abuse situations in California, and I'm up in Maine. So I can't do a whole lot, but I can tell them, I can look up and help them find who they can contact, who are the domestic violence resources out there, and put them in touch with people and shelters and so on. So we do a lot of that. We also just do a lot of working through with people. Can you record in your state some of these conversations or abuse events that are happening? Those kinds of things. But in church specific, we sometimes do send advocates with people to meetings. We've done that a couple of times. So if they are called into a meeting with the elders and we feel like that they need some extra support, we try to look for somebody who can go with them. We also can help them sometimes file charges, and we help churches too. I mean, we've had pastors reach out to us and say, hey, we really could use some assistance on this. We've had a complaint about abuse in the church, and sometimes the elders are like, we just don't feel comfortable talking to a woman about sexual assault. And if you could maybe talk to her and see what's going on. And so we've done some of that. It's helped that the Presbyterian Advocacy Coalition does actually have a lot of experience behind it. So one of the women that's involved as one of the directors is, she is a licensed therapist, and she worked as the director of a domestic violence shelter in Little Rock for 15 years. So she has a lot of really good experience. I, of course, worked in domestic violence here in Maine for a couple of years, and I'm actually still a social worker now, although in slightly different capacity. And so we have a fair amount of experience with, and then of course just our personal experience, and we have some good advisors too in the OPC, just helping us to say, hey, how can we put this evidence together? How can we? How do you present this to a presbytery? That how to write an appeal or complaints, and so it's been good. We've had a lot of response. I wasn't sure when we first started it, like, are we going to get many calls? And but it's been, we've had a lot of good response. We've heard a lot of really sad stories too. But
yeah,
to me, I feel like if I can help that, use some of my experience to do some kind of good. And I love the OPC. I still do. And I would like to see it turn around on this. It really breaks my heart that it turned out that way. And I mean, I always say nobody could have loved it more than I did. I just gave it my heart and soul in my last church too. I mean, I was the church secretary and designed the website and ran the BBS program and all of the things. And I would love to see it change and become something better than it is now. And I'm hoping that some of this work will bring it to that place.
I would like to thank Theresa Garcia Robertson, Zach LeReaux, and Caroline McKuen for their courage and vulnerability. Theresa stated it well towards the beginning of this episode. Are the presbyteries there to keep ministers and leadership accountable, or Are they there to keep them out of trouble? I had a conversation with Scott Lanke of Sacred Thoughts podcast a week ago, and it got me thinking. He asked me, why do you think churches want to handle abuse in-house? There's this good and right desire for the church to make an impact on their community, to be a beacon of light in a dark world, to have a strong reputation, one that magnifies the gospel of Jesus Christ, takes care of the widow, poor, and the orphan, and provides community to a lonely world. Too often, the church and individuals like myself think we have to project a certain image of ourselves to the watching world. We think, if this gets out, what will people think about us, about me? If they learn about this horrific thing that happened in our community, no one will ever visit us again, and we might lose our people. So, we hide. We put our armor on, and we don't let the scandal see the light of day. We push it down. We hope and pray to God no one will ever see what we've done, who we've become, and what we've allowed to happen to ourselves and to our people. It becomes a self-perpetuating cycle, a circle of abuse and a subsequent cover-up. As long as we present ourselves as a certain kind of church or put together human being, maybe others will start believing us. Maybe we'll believe ourselves. The longer this goes on, the harder you have to try, the more fervent your cover-up efforts become. No one, you repeat, no one can hear about this. Lives are sacrificed at the altar of feigned reputation. We'd rather a faked community than a real one. Can you imagine if church officers were honest about what happened in Theresa's situation, in Zach's? What work would Caroline have? If everyone who came on Sons of Patriarchy were told, I'm sorry, we really messed up. We will take the consequences coming for us. We will pay our due. How can we make this up to you? I bet you we wouldn't exist. We don't exist because the church is trying too hard to provide a gospel-centered community. We exist because the church is faking one. We can do better. We must do better. The church has done better. Next week, we begin exposing a new denomination, the PCA, though we will continue profiling the OPC and the CREC. In fact, we have specials on a few CREC congregations with especially egregious stories. Those are coming soon. See you then.